Hey everybody, welcome. So let's see. This is our first lecture, and I'm going to give you a little bit of an orientation of what these lectures are going to look like first, and then we'll jump into this one. I think this one's going to be a little bit shorter than normal. Um, where do we start? Okay, so first of all, most of my lectures, if you've had a class with me, you kind of know how this goes. I stand in front of this thing. This is my PowerPoint. It's actually a green screen, but you get the idea. I stand in front of this thing, I talk for about an hour, and then we're done. However, I know that lecturing doesn't work. It doesn't help you learn as much. So everything that I've ever read or ever been told says don't lecture to people for an hour. It sucks. And so I'm going to try and do differently sometimes, and other times I'm just going to have to do this. I'm going to try and split up my lectures into like half-hour chunks because I've heard you guys say it's helpful when you have a life interruption. It's hard to get back to the same place you were, and it's hard to sit for an hour and listen to me ramble on because I talk kind of fast, and sometimes I go down these rabbit holes of thought that it takes me a while to get back on track and all that kind of stuff. So, with that said, I'm going to try and take about a half hour, take a break, chop up the lectures a little bit more with some questions, maybe some assignments. We'll see how well that goes. I'm not sure how I'm going to do that yet, but I'm going to do my best to try and do stuff like that to make it a little bit more engaging, easier to follow along, that kind of stuff. The other part is that there are going to be several chapters for sure, and maybe I'll even split up some of these lectures by looking at the textbook. In fact, I'll show you what that's going to look like. Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to point the camera down to the textbook, and we'll look at something like this. And the reason I'm going to do this is because once we get into the chapter 5 and we're doing statistics and we're looking at what is the normal curve and what are the standard scores and what does kurtosis mean and all that kind of stuff, I want to be able to draw some pictures or point to pictures like this kind of stuff. It'll be a little bit easier to understand the concepts. The other part of it is that I want to walk you through these chapters and say, hey, you guys read this stuff. I'm not going to You guys can read and you're smart people, but what I hope to provide is something in addition to the textbook. So I'm just going to walk you through the textbook and say, hey, this concept relates to this picture back here. Look at this. And this is what I think is important to pull out of this paragraph and all that kind of stuff. I think that's going to be more valuable than just taking stuff out of the textbook, putting it on a PowerPoint behind me, and then standing in front of it and you having to reference back and forth, all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to try and do a little bit of that kind of thing. So we'll spend a little bit of time in the textbook. We'll spend a little bit of time doing this kind of thing, just talking and discussing, and hopefully that'll work well enough to keep your attention, to help you understand the things you need to understand, and make this not suck. One of the things about this class, I probably said this in an introduction video, is that people can find assessment to be stale and boring and kind of scared of the statistics and all that kind of stuff. I want you to, as well as you can, even though we got to cover a lot of material in this class, I want you to pick out the parts that are relevant to you, the parts that you feel confident in learning, even the parts that you're scared to learn a little bit or are frustrated with the process of having to learn them. Take those out and figure out what's relevant to you for your future work, that kind of thing. So I think that's all the stuff that I want to cover in terms of what I think is relevant for the first lecture here. But let's just jump into it. I got to move my book around here, squat down so I don't chop my own head off. All right, let's talk about the introduction to assessment. Okay, so above all else, more than anything, if you don't learn anything from this class except this one thing, is that know that assessment is an ongoing process that lasts throughout the whole counseling relationship. We tend to think of it as this thing that happens at the beginning, like, okay, you fill out your forms and you talk about your informed consent and get all the legal crap out of the way, and then, okay, we can get to the real work, right? And the real work is building relationship, and it's building trust, and it's learning about people and whatever, all the other stuff that counseling is about, right? It's all these beautiful things about building relationship and supporting and validating and all those kind of things that feel so good to us. And assessment is like this, ugh, gross. We got to get numbers and we got to do stuff with paperwork and all that kind of thing. What I'm going to make the argument here, and this comes in the book also, is that even though we will talk about Scantron sheets and we're going to talk about numbers and data and all that kind of stuff, more than anything, what we're trying to do is we're trying to go through this long process of collecting information, because we want to identify what the heck is the problem and what the heck are we going to do about it, right? We want to make sure we choose the right treatments, the proper diagnosis, the right interventions, all that kind of stuff. And we're going to do it in this ongoing, fluid, and dynamic way, meaning we can change our minds as we go along. We might see one thing as a problem and then be like, oh, I totally missed this detail, or I have to change my mind because they didn't tell me this thing last week, or something like that. And that's okay. Couple analogies here to give us some context here for this. It's helpful for me to think about this, even though I don't really consider myself that much of a scientist most of the time. Sometimes I do. But I think about, okay, this person comes in. I know that, and I'm just going to make a bunch of details up. I know they're male. I know they're 17 years old. And I know they are, I'll put myself back in my 17-year-old body. Here's a dude. He's a white dude. He lives in a middle class, from a middle class family. Lives in a upper class, relatively affluent friend group in the community he's part of. Here's what I think I know about him already. I'm going to make a hypothesis about the kinds of problems he might be having or the kinds of conditions he might be experiencing, something like that. Because I have a hypothesis, I'm then going to test it. Tell me about your friends. Tell me about your family. Tell me about your school. Tell me about your whatever. And then as I get that information back, I'm going to start changing my hypothesis. Okay, now I think there's this other thing going on, and I'm going to test constantly. Come up with an idea. This is what I think is going on. Ask a question about it. You get information back. That's not what's going on. I was totally wrong about that. That's just the scientific method in action, right? So that's one way we can think about this, is we're always changing our minds and testing and using different questions to find out what the problem is, or how a person's doing, or we're manipulating our questions so that we can change a variable inside this person, say like having change their confidence or their self-concept to build self-esteem or whatever it might be. That's one way to think about this. Another completely different way that's not so scientific is, let's say you go into the doctor's office. I used to skateboard when I was a kid a lot, snowboard and skateboard and all that kind of crap. And so I'd see people break their bones, not all the time, but more than most people probably. Let's say I was skateboarding and I broke my leg and my bone was sticking out of my leg, and I walk into the doctor's office and I say, "All right, doctor, I need some help." And she says, "Okay, let's think about this here. Do you have a cough?" And I say, "Yeah, a little bit. Why?" She goes, "I see the problem. You have a cough and you need some cough medicine." And so she prescribes me some cough medicine, and I go about my way. Well, she did an incomplete assessment because she didn't even see the bone that was sticking out of my leg, and she gave me the wrong treatment because the real problem was that I have a bone sticking out of my leg, not that I have a cough. So I have the wrong a poor assessment led to the wrong treatment. That's the whole idea here, is we want to gather enough information that we can make a complete and correct, accurate assessment so that we can provide the right treatments. That's the whole thing. And we're going to be doing that ongoing, because we're always going to be gathering new information that might change how we understand and how we think about this person. So assessment is not just testing, it's not just scantrons, it's not just fancy math. It's just learning and discovering and being curious all the time so that we can make sure we're doing the right thing for people. That's the whole idea here. So I'm going to try, because the book tends to focus more on the math and more on the tools and the assessments and all that kind of stuff, and in counseling we tend to focus more on the relationships. I was going to add some more to that, but I think I'll just leave it out. We focus more on the relationships. I want to try and keep that idea in mind as we go through this whole process of learning all these different things. I suspect that for many of you, this class will be kind of one of those, like, this is what I get for feedback a lot about this class. I didn't think I was going to like it, but it actually ended up being kind of interesting, and I kind of actually liked the class after I was done with it. I'm going to do as much as I can to encourage that, so that you can take out of this class the stuff that you need to continuously be curious about your clients and to continuously be doing that assessment process, whether you use all the math, whether you go out and purchase the fanciest tools that money can buy, or whether you just grab the free stuff off the internet. As long as you're using this so that you understand people better and treat them better, that's the goal here. So that's just to put that into context. Okay, I kind of already talked about this other stuff, so we'll just kind of keep going with this. There are a lot of different terms, and there's a lot of different jargon. There's this whole lexicon that comes along with assessment in the counseling world. We'll hear things like a test, assessment, survey, questionnaire, battery, screening tool, scales, all this kind of stuff. It's got its own language, right? We'll hear all this new language of stuff. In the very beginning, they talk about this word called screening, and actually, we'll go through more of that language when we get to the next chapter, I think, next week probably. But this is one they talk about in the very beginning. Screening is basically just what you do with the person to assess them before they even come into your office. Have you ever been to the doctor's office? They give you a family history questionnaire and symptom questionnaire, and they ask you questions about, like, do you have any of these medical conditions in your background, all that kind of stuff. That's just a semi-standardized, informal way of gathering information about you in advance that they don't want to have to spend their time doing while they're seeing you, because their time is valuable, and so is yours, and so will all of your clients. It'll be valuable to them too. What you can also get, which we're going to be covering this week, is you might get something like the PHQ-9 that's going to test for depression, or you might use something like the PHQ-9 or the Beck's Depression Inventory, which says most of my clients come in with some flavor of depression or anxiety, and if it's not specifically anxiety, it might be contributing to another disorder like OCD or an eating disorder or something like that. So you might give the Beck's Anxiety Inventory as a screening tool to say, before we even see each other, I'd just like to know if this is going to be a thing. I'd like to know this information in advance. That's what a screening tool is. It's done before the relationship is established. They're usually self-report. They're really quick. They're easy. They're not super complicated. There's no way someone can screw it up, really, So that's one purpose of assessment, is to get baseline information before people even come in. Another one, we've already talked about it, identification and diagnosis. We're going to be talking about diagnosis, clinical assessment in pretty good detail, probably mid-semester, and I think that's probably what most of you are going to be waiting for. I think in a future, I'm recording this as one of the first videos that I'm doing in the class. I haven't even recorded the syllabus video, but one of the things that I always talk about there is when are we going to get to the good stuff, depending on what kind of what your interests are. I think a lot of you are going to be looking forward to that clinical assessment stuff, and so that'll come probably at the mid-semester or something like that. But there we'll talk specifically about diagnosis of mental health disorders, but probably we're going to be talking about that all the way through. Some of you are going to be doing voc rehab, and I'm going to try, that's my specialty. If you don't know that, that's my specialty. So I'm going to be trying to pepper in information about career information and disability-related kind of stuff throughout this whole thing, which may or may not relate to mental health diagnosis, but it's extremely relevant to all of us regardless. So that's one of the reasons why we do this. Intervention planning, I already mentioned that. Progress and outcomes, what they basically mean by that is that, let's say you give the Beck's Depression Inventory as a screening tool because you want to know what a client's depression levels are like. And sure enough, after the first hour, you say, this person, I think they have major depressive disorder, and then they go home and they don't come back for 3 weeks. Schedule a new appointment and they come back in 3 weeks. 3 weeks they come back, and let's just say they're getting better. They seem better. Something happened, they just got a raise at their job and they're feeling really good about themselves. So you might give them the Beck's Depression Inventory again and say, okay, here's where you were last week. Here's where you are this week. And maybe you use this tool ongoing throughout the weeks and say, or throughout the times that they come in and see you, and you say, well, let's just kind of follow your progress. Are you making progress? Are you having, ups and downs as we move through the treatment process? What's that like? And so when I talked about ongoing assessment, it might be formal with the Becks. It might be informal. You just ask them questions, something like that. But that's why we do it, is we want to track progress. How we gather information. This interviews, tests, and observations. These are the 3 categories that the authors of the book talk about. We're going to talk about those in more detail next week, so I'm just going to leave these there, basically. You're probably all familiar with these terms, at least to some degree. Everybody knows what an interview is, whether it's free-flowing and sort of, I cut off my finger, free-flowing and kind of off the cuff, based on your own experience, and you let the conversation go wherever it needs to go, or whether it's you're following a checklist based on things that you typically want to know about clients, that kind of thing. There are very few clinical interviews that I'm familiar with that are really structured. This is more for like research purposes, that kind of thing. But it's part of the assessment process. The structured part of the assessment process usually comes from tests, like standardized tests. Reading the questions word for word at a certain pace, at a certain cadence, in a certain tone, and that kind of stuff. That's more of the standardized stuff that we're going to be talking about. But then you can read the rest of this. We'll get into this stuff all to a greater degree later, but except for maybe the observational stuff. Mostly the stuff that we're going to talk about with observation is the mini mental status exam, which we'll get to later in the semester, probably mid-semester sometime. And I'll just wait to explain that later. And then the sources of information, all of you are going to be familiar with some of this, but we'll see examples of lots of different kinds of how information is gathered. Most of it's going to happen from the client. You're going to be talking to them, they're going to tell you a bunch of stuff. But let's say there are times where they're an unreliable narrator, we'll say, and they say, you know, I'm super sick and I can't go on anymore. And you find out they're like, no, they're not that bad. They're just super big complainers. They're just whining a lot or something like that. So you're going to want to go to other sources, right? You want to find out, is this normal for them, or is it normal for their environment, or what? So you go to these collateral sources, just other people, other places to gather information. Some of them might be personal. You might have a lady who comes in with postpartum depression and she says, I have such a hard time at home. I'm just constantly scared for my child and I feel terrible about myself. My body has changed and all this stuff. And you say, well, where's your husband? Would he be willing to come in and talk to us about what he sees? And maybe he can be a support for you. So is it possible to get him in here to talk about how he can keep himself healthy when you're in these bad places? But also, what's going on from an outside perspective? Just one example. You guys can probably pull a million examples from your experience about when family members are useful in understanding about their child or, mom or dad or whatever it is. Professional sources are probably pretty obvious as well. If you're working in the school system, you might go talk to teachers about how's little Johnny or Jane behaving in class. When they come to me, they're an angel, but they keep coming over here saying that they just bit some kid's arm or something. So, why? What was going on beforehand? Other counselors, doctors, whatever. You get the idea. Records is an important one as well. One of the things I will mention about records is that depending on your setting and depending on your own personal preference, whether you read, how much you read the records and rely on those, will be kind of, it'll differ from between all of you. Some people say, I need to read everything I possibly can so I have an understanding of what I'm going into because I want to be careful, I want to be thorough, I want to be cautious, I want to be informed and all that kind of stuff. Others of you will say, reading the records have sometimes unhelpful, damaging, biasing information. They can be misleading, all kinds of stuff. So I'm not going to taint my perspective of this person. I want to go in with a clean slate and say, how do I experience them firsthand? How do I see them as a person and all this kind of stuff? And then some of you will never go back to the records, which I think probably not a great idea, but some of you will do that. That's your thing. So I want to say that there's information there, and to be a part of a treatment network and to understand that person's experience from the eyes of other people who have experienced them can be helpful. It can be really important, but depending on your setting and depending on your personal style, that may or may be more or less relevant. And I guess that goes for all this stuff. Whether you want to invite spouses in is kind of personal comfort level. It's a strategic decision on your part to whether you think that information is going to be helpful or useful. All those things go into this. By the way, I think this is a good time for a rabbit hole conversation. The way you make choices like that, whether it's a good idea to invite spouses in, whether it's a good idea to read the records, a lot of these things we're going to talk about generally, and then you're going to go out to your practicums and your internships and your first jobs and all that kind of stuff, and you're going to say, okay, now how does my agency do it? How do I want to set my own standards so that they work for me? and they get the best information, and I can provide the best treatments and all that kind of stuff. So we're talking about them kind of generally here, and you may not even be able to make these decisions right now. So if you're like, I don't know what the best thing is to do, and he says there's all kinds of decisions that you can make, but we're not making any of them, and you're getting kind of annoyed with that process, that annoyance is going to be a continuous theme throughout this class, because there's a lot of stuff that we're going to say, well, later on when you get there, you'll be able to do this, but we won't really be able to do it just yet. You know what I mean? One of the things I would love to do is, and again, this might be mentioned in the syllabus video or something else, is I put in a petition to the school, or I don't know what it's called, application or whatever it is, so that we could charge a fee for the class, and everybody pays a small fee, but I can use that to then purchase some tests from Pearson or PAR or whatever it is, so that you can take some of these tests, ones that are pretty difficult to make available to you unless we have access through the school. So I would love to get your hands on all kinds of things, but we can't necessarily do that. However, when you get out into the community and you're working in these different agencies, they might have access to these things, and we'll have to say, well, here's kind of what they look like, but I'm going to teach you the basic concepts, and then you'll have to go out there and apply them, but you just can't do it yet. So getting that practice is kind of a tricky thing in this class. So it's worth mentioning that. The assessment process. What page does this start on? Excuse me for a second. Page 8 in the 9th edition textbook. I think this is probably one of the more important beginning concepts to learn about out of this whole first chapter. We talk about identifying the problem, like I give you the broken leg example, and you're like, oh yeah, obviously it's a broken leg. Who would miss that? Some dummy says it's a cough. That doesn't really work. Well, it sounds easy, but it's really, really tricky. And even though you're like, oh yeah, okay, I gotta identify the problem. Well, people are gonna someone will come in and they'll say, yes, my wife made me come here. Okay, why did she make you come here? I don't know. Well, what's the problem? Ask her. And you'll have these just stubborn as heck clients who don't want to talk. And then you'll have people who will not shut up for 1 second. There's like for like an hour. And you're like, they told me everything about their life, and now I don't even know what's going on because I couldn't find the relevant details, and I was trying to pull things out, and I couldn't direct the conversation to get the information I needed and all that stuff. So identifying the problem it sounds like it's a pretty simple thing, but it can be really complicated, which is why we require master's degrees and lots of practice and all that kind of stuff to get good at it. But it's that initial stage. After that initial stage, you're just like we talked about with the interview. Did we talk about it? I think we did. You do the interview, you collect a bunch of information, but then oftentimes, and this is very often, you're like, okay, well, I don't know the whole story, but I need more information. And sometimes I can't gather everything I need. So let's say I have a client who has some intellectual disability of some kind, or some cognitive deficit, or a neurological abnormality, or something like that. And I can't just go take an axe and bang their head and it comes open. I take a flashlight and shine it around in there. That doesn't work, because our mind does not necessarily live in our heads. It's a philosophical question, I guess, but we just can't do that. It doesn't work that way. So we use these tools. We organize questions, we structure them in such a way that we can get at how is this thing working in here without having to open it up. How do we understand about brain function without having to open up a brain? Or maybe more relevant to us is, how do we understand the nuances of a relationship even when people can't really find the language to talk about it because they're not counselors or psychologists or whatever it is. So we use these tools because they give us more information than a person can self-report, and more information than we can pull out from just an interview alone. That's part of the reason why we're doing this. So we have to carefully select those methods. Another way to explain that is that somebody will come into your office and they'll say, yeah, I'm on the phone. They said, yeah, I'm kind of depressed, whatever. And then you come in, you find out that they've been burning things or killing cats or something like that, and you're like, well, I think I need another kind of assessment here to really figure out what the heck is going on, because it's complicated, right? Does this person have, did they grow up with reactive attachment disorder and now they have some sort of antisocial personality disorder and they thought it was just depression, and now you're like, oh, I don't know. there's a part of this where you're just assessing what kind of test is going to meet my needs or meet the client's needs. It's going to give me the kind of information that I think I need to get. That's part of what we're going to be talking about throughout the class too. So careful selection of the right kind of, knowing what you don't know and then figuring out how to get it. That's essentially what this class is going to cover too. Once you've selected the right assessment, then you need to actually be able to understand what the outcomes are. If you have the Beck's Depression Inventory and all you do after the end of that is you add up the scores, and then at the bottom it said, well, if you scored 18, here's what that means. If you scored 12, here's what that means. That's pretty easy, right? That's pretty within the realm of Class A tests like we talked about. But if you have to do any kind of manipulating of the data in order to make it meaningful, like for example, and you don't have to know what this means, we'll talk about it later, but if you have to take the raw scores and turn them into scaled scores, and then take the scaled scores and turn those into standard scores and make sure there's percentiles in there and then interpret that so that a person can understand what the heck all that means, that's going to take a little bit of extra time and a little bit of extra training. So we actually have to have the knowledge to be able to do that kind of thing. For the more complicated clients and the more complicated assessments that will meet their needs, that's what we're getting prepared for, that kind of thing. Your investment in this class and how much you pull out of it and how much you're interested in and all that kind of stuff will depend on the kinds of clients that you'll be able to see, because you'll be able to manage the intensity levels or the uniqueness of their conditions or something like that. So there's that part. And then reporting and recommending, that is sort of the final step, the tip of the iceberg, if you will. How do we talk about, it's the end piece. It's, okay, now that we've understood what's going on, we identified the problem, we found a little bit more information about the problem, we understand what the results are, we can now then say, okay, based on this problem, guy's got a broken leg, now we know how to fix it, put a cast on it, or send him to inpatient treatment, or an outpatient group, or we're going to do a structured DBT workshop, or we're going to do outpatient counseling once a week, or 3 times a week, or once a year. The opportunities are dependent on what's available in your community and kind of endless, but they're not endless. But that's what we're going to do, is we're going to say, what's the end result now? What's the intervention that we're going to be recommending? And also, who are we reporting that to? Who gets that information? And who asked for it in the first place? So, during the second half of this class, we're going to talk about, or we're going to do an assignment, actually, where, and I've already described this elsewhere, but we're going to do an assignment where you have a client, a fake client, and you're going to do an interview and then select some assessments, all this stuff, basically, and then you're going to interpret that, and part of that will be understanding who is the referral source. Why did this person seek help? It's going to be a little weird in this class because we're going to be actually finding them, and they're not going to be finding us, or some of you might be working with each other, something like that. But if you're doing your job and a lady calls you and says, I need you to see my husband because he is a nut job and we're getting a divorce and he is making my life hell, so please see him. For whatever reason, the husband decides he's going to come in and talk to you. The person who referred was the wife, and that relationship dynamic really might change the kind of assessment you're going to do and the kinds of treatment that you're going to do, because you might say, look, after the first session you say, you know what, I don't see anything wrong with you. It's that lady who on the phone was slurring her speech and she sounded like she was drunk when she called or something like that, and you'd be like, you're not the problem, she is. And so understanding the referral question helps determine what the recommendations are. See what I mean? If you have a person who, I'll just give you an example from my life. I do forensic, sometimes I do forensic reporting or analysis for disability purposes and future costs of disability and that kind of thing. If I get an attorney who sends me a referral to go talk to their evaluee, and we don't call them clients in that setting, that's a whole other story, but talk to the evaluee, the person with a disability, the kind of information that I pull out and the way that I write it is more for, it's in legalese, the legal language, so the attorney can understand it and it's useful for their case. It's also, the kind of information I'm gathering is a lot different than what I would do if I were doing a clinical interview. I'm not going to go into the details of why, but just understand that the referral question, the person who's asking for the information, makes a difference to what kind of recommendations you're making and what the reports look like. We'll see some different examples of different kinds of reports, and you guys will get the chance to make your own recommendations. If you're going to be in outpatient treatment, you're going to recommend a certain kind of intervention or therapy. If you've done substance abuse treatment, which a lot of you have, you're also talking about levels of care that they'll need, what sort of setting they need to be in. Is it, take a trip away from your home and get into a rehab center somewhere else where you're there for 2 to 4 weeks, whatever? Or are you in an outpatient only basis, depending on your level of risk or need or something like that? So there's a lot of differences there. We'll go into those. Where are we at for time? 30 minutes. Okay, I think I need to hustle up just a little bit. This, by the way, this is even though I mentioned I was going to try and cut them down to 30 minutes, this is our first one. I think it's going to be a little bit shorter, even though we're covering 2 chapters. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit. On pages 11 and 12 and pages 30 and 31, there are 2 lists, which I can't really figure out the differences between the 2 lists. They're both pretty complete lists about the competencies that you will cover or you should have, that either you will cover in this book or that you should have by the time you get out and are ready to take your test. I was considering taking those competencies and just putting them as our learning objectives for this class. And my phone is annoying me. It's in my pocket, buzzing, shaking my leg. It's weird. I was considering taking all those lists of competencies and saying, hey, those are going to be our goals for the class. We're going to learn all these things. Partly because, for 2 reasons. One, at the end of the class, you might look back and say, okay, did I actually learn all these things? Did the class teach me the things I need to know? And so it'd be a good gauge for us to say, did we cover everything that we need to? The other thing is that those are the kind of things that you'll find on the NCE test, the National Board Exam. You'll see questions about these things on the board exam. The reason I didn't do that and why I'm kind of telling you about them, but I'm not making it a formal part of the class, is there's some stuff. I can find an example real quick. There's some stuff that is helpful and useful, and other stuff that's like, we're not going to go there, for good reason. Page 11, the first one of these 2, in chapter 1, number 3 says, compute and apply measurement formulas such as the standard error of measurement and the Spearman-Brown prophecy formula. We're not going to do that. I'm not going to make you compute everything. We're definitely not going to do the Spearman-Brown. And, well, actually, I can't remember if that's one of the ones that we're going to look at or not. But regardless, I don't care. I don't think you need to either. If you're going to be doing some more complicated assessments with the actual standardized tools, you may need to know that. If you're going to be doing research, you will definitely need to know that. But for the purposes of what the great majority of what we're going to be doing in here and what you're going to be doing out in the real world, we're not going to need to know that. So there's great benefit in looking at this list and saying, just give me a general idea of most of the things I need to know so I can study for the board exam, so I know what I'm getting out of this class. But if you see things like that and you're like, I need to know the Spearman-Brown prophecy formula, no, you don't. So if you have questions about any of that stuff, let me know, and I'm happy to say, we're going to cover this but not that, and I think you need to know this but not the other thing, and we'll talk about that more. The other thing you'll notice about these first 2 chapters is I didn't have you read everything. I didn't have you read the history. There's some stuff in here about the ACA code of, the part of the code of ethics that relates to assessment. You're going to be talking about the code of ethics, how to use them, what they're for, why they're important, all that stuff in other classes. So all of that applies here. Just know that there are some standards for the assessment use and how to use them and how to do that in an ethical way. So you can check that out. You can read those if you want to. You should read them. The reason I'm kind of pausing and questioning here is that you need to read them. You should, at some point, you need to read through the entire code of ethics. It's not that long. It won't take you that long. But more than anything, it's like a reference manual. So when you get out to the point where you're going to be starting to use assessments and you have one in your hands and you're actually going to apply it, that would be a great time to come back to the code of ethics and say, okay, let me just check my, touch base with it, cover my bases, check to make sure I have all my ducks in a row. I don't know how many analogies I can give you here, but so that I'm doing this in the best way possible. To just read it now and say, okay, now I understand it, but I'm not actually trying to apply it yet. It's really going to be kind of hard to do. So that's why I'm pausing for a second. So I'd say to go back and read that later. Excuse me. So this is one of the things that confuses people a lot. And it relates to testing qualifications. How do I know what tests I can give and which ones I can't? This system was put into place by not the publishers of the test, but the sellers of the test, because there are some tests that require a lot of training. We'll talk about some of those, and there are some that are what we call high stakes, which means they can have a huge impact on a person's life. Take the MMPI-2 or the MMPI-RF. It's the multifaceted Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, and it's based off of the DSM criteria, and all of it is about pathology. It's about how do I diagnose somebody with as many of the different pathologies or diagnoses in the DSM that are possible. Some of the more complicated ones even. And there are scales that are used to help test for things like malingering. Is a person lying or not, or pretending to be more sick than they are, or more healthy than they are, and that kind of thing. So because it has that capability, it gets used in forensic cases a lot. It gets used in inpatient facilities a lot, like inpatient hospitals or psych wards or something like that. And because they can have impacts on how long a person has to stay in inpatient confinement, essentially, or is this person going to get the death sentence? Because of that, they have a huge impact on people's lives. And so it requires a lot of training and a lot of practice and familiarity, and to make sure you're using it appropriately. So that's what the whole purpose of this. Now, the general rule of thumb is that level A requires a bachelor's degree or less, oftentimes less. Level B is what you guys will be qualified to have to do is a master's degree to get to use level B tests, which is the great majority of tests. You'll be able to use just about everything except some of the more advanced intelligence tests and some of the advanced personality tests, but only a couple of them. And then level C is, of course, for those, so you can do just about anything. I technically have a level C certification because I have a PhD, a doctorate degree in counseling or a related field. But there are a lot of tests that I am not qualified to take, to give, to purchase, or to give or administer to somebody else. So even though this is a rule of thumb, there's a couple things I want to say about it. Number one, just because you have a certification doesn't mean you're competent or have the experience to use those tests. Just because you have a level B training, this is another thing, just because you have a level B certification or credentials to qualify for level B tests, doesn't mean you can't inform yourself and understand about some of the more complicated tests and learn these things and teach yourself and go take another training class and get supervision and all these kind of things and be able to do these kind of things. So there's a little bit of fluidity here too. I mean, these are sort of a general rule of thumb, and there are more criteria than just this. But just know that if you, it's to protect people who think they can do everything, but they really can't. It's also, it's basically to keep people safe, right? That's the whole purpose. And that's the good reason why this is here. But it also has the side effect of restricting people from thinking they can do more than they actually can. So we're going to be walking that balance throughout the semester. Personally, I tend to fall a little bit more along the lines of I think I can do more than I actually can. And that's because one of my personality traits and the way that I've survived in life is to say, if there's a problem that I don't know an answer to, I'm going to find it. If there's something I think I can't do, I'm going to go figure out how I can do it. And so that confidence has served me well in a lot of places, but I run the risk of getting into situations over my head. So I have to be careful about that within my own personal life. Part of the reason why I've got an advanced degree is because there's a lot to learn and lots of things I want to know, but I can't know everything, right? So I have to be really careful about this is my ethical responsibility. What am I competent in, and what can I actually do, and what do I not know? And I have to sort of get trained on or feel like I understand. There are going to be a lot of situations in this class where you're like, oh my gosh, I don't get it. This is so hard. It's so confusing, all that kind of stuff. And part of my job will be to say, yes, it is hard. Be careful about that. And yes, it is kind of scary and there's a lot of responsibility. but also embrace that responsibility and challenge yourself to learn new things and to be better and bigger than you were before. So that's all I'll say about that. There's probably a lot more that we could say, but if you're ever confused about that, this is one of those things where you consult your friends, you consult your peers, you consult your colleagues, you consult me and the other people here at the school, whatever it is. Not something you have to answer alone. Okay, client welfare, informed consent. You guys have all talked about informed consent in your ethics classes. You probably already know what that is. The important thing here is that people know kind of two things. They know what the test is and what it's for. They know what they're getting into when they go to take this test. And the other thing is what's going to happen with the results at the end. If the assessment is court ordered, who's going to get those results and what do they mean? That might affect how they perform the test. It might affect on what you write up and how you write the stuff on the test, the reporting for it. If it's totally private to you as a counselor between you and your client, that might matter too. So make sure they know what's going to happen with that information. And oftentimes you'll see one of two things. Well, it's kind of a spectrum. You'll have people who are super paranoid and they say, I don't want anybody to ever see this ever in my life. Bury it, lock it up, and throw it in the sea. And other people who are like, hey, I got nothing to hide. You show anybody you want. And you have to consider both of those perspectives and help the person over here saying, I don't care what happens to my data or my information about me. You have to say, well, but there's some things that could happen that might not be so good. So I'm going to help rein in your freedom here. Other people who are super paranoid, you might say, well, you're not going to get your needs met if you don't take this assessment and do it honestly. So, that's what this is all about. That's it. Oh, that's it. All right, cool. So, I have nothing else to say. I think I'll just leave it at that. See you later.